Welcome to the Augsburg Panel with your host, Jake Zabel. So hello and welcome to the October 2019 Augsburg Panel. I'm your host, Reverend Jake Zabel, the pastor of St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church, Dalby, Queensland, a member congregation of the Confessional Orthodox Evangelical Lutheran Communion. The Augsburg Panel is a podcast produced by the Order of Knight George. It's a monthly Q&A podcast where I get a panel of Lutheran theologians to answer listener questions. If you'd like to get any of your questions answered by future panels, you can either contact us via Facebook or email us at knightgeorge@outlook.com.au. If you'd like to check out any of the other content produced by the Order of Knight George, you can head over to YouTube, SoundCloud or iTunes and just search the Order of Knight George, or head over to our website www.knightgeorge.info. So to get started, I'll introduce our panelists for the month, and the first panelist is a fellow pastor from the Confessional Orthodox Evangelical Lutheran Communion, Pastor Magnus Sørensen from the Augastana Evangelical Lutheran Church in Aarhus, Denmark. Pastor Sørensen, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your ministry?
Yes. I've been a pastor in Augastana Lutheran Church since 2007. We broke out from the Evangelical Lutheran Free Church in Denmark, which is a church that is in fellowship with the Missouri Synod. And we broke because they had fired a pastor with to do with union. And I was ordained at that time, and a few years after we joined on woman suffrage, the other pastor, and then we, after a few more years, we entered in fellowship with the COELC in the United States, and we suspended fellowship last summer and broke finally fellowship around Christmas last year on the doctrine of justification. Yes, because I don't teach the at least not the kind of universal objective justification that the OLCC does. I might accept the vocabulary in some senses, though I don't think it's precise. So, and then at that time we also entered fellowship with Jake, and we have formed the COELC recently. So, and I went down and ordained Jake. Yeah,
thanks for that. And our next panelist is Pastor Terry Stringer of the St. Dismas Lutheran Church. Pastor Terry, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us about your ministry?
Yeah, I'm Pastor Terry. I was formerly a member of the Missouri Synod and left to join the ministerium of the Independent Lutheran Diocese, in which I was ordained this last October. Not last October, but the October.
And we were going to have the famous Fillmore Alvarez from the Aldona joining us, but it seems that due to our party next to him, it was kind of drowning out his recording, and so we couldn't actually hear him. So he's at the moment not joining us for this panel. He might join us a little later on. We'll see how things go, but otherwise we'll get underway with the questions with Pastors Magnus and Pastor Terry. Now, you guys know the rules. Each question, I'll give each panelist their turn to answer the question, and if you've got a disagreement, you're happy to debate, but I want all debates to be kept mature, theological, respectful. We don't need name-calling or emotionally charged arguments or the like, so keep it civil, you two. Alrighty, so the first question we have is, which issues would require you to break fellowship with another Lutheran Synod church body, and at what point does it become schismatic? This question is asked especially in light of Article 7 paragraphs 2 and 3 of the Augsburg Confession, which, just before I get the first one to use the answers, for the listener's sake, I will read out this section from the Augsburg Confession, which says, "For this is enough for the true unity of the Christian Church, that there the gospel is preached harmoniously according to a pure understanding, and the sacraments are administered in conformity with the divine word. It is not necessary for the true unity of the Christian Church that uniform ceremonies instituted by human beings be observed everywhere." So that's the section that this question wants you to consider when answering your question. We'll get Pastor Magnus to start first with this one.
Yeah. Well, I think we should add the Formula of Concord, Epitome 10:7, which says a little bit more than the Augsburg Confession, Article 7. It says, "We believe, teach, and confess also that no church should condemn another because one has less or more external ceremonies not commanded by God than the other. If otherwise, there is agreement among them in doctrine and all its articles, as also in the right use of the holy sacraments. According to the well-known saying, disagreement in fasting does not destroy agreement in faith." So I think it is sometimes Augsburg Confession 7 is misused to try to make a dichotomy between the gospel and doctrine. But the real distinction there is between the gospel and all doctrines, and then on the other hand, ceremonies that one might have or not have, that are not commanded in God's word. So I don't think we can use Augsburg Confession Articles 7 to say that something less than complete agreement in doctrine is required. Matthew 28 teaches that we should teach all that Christ has commanded, and Paul claims in Acts 20 that he is not guilty in anyone's blood because he has taught the whole counsel of God. And so when Romans 16:17 and 2 Thessalonians 3:14-15 says that we should stay away from those who teach false doctrine, it's all doctrine that is meant. So Scripture alone decide what is doctrine and what is not. I think the distinction we can make is between something that we might call explanations of doctrine, or that is not in itself doctrine, and then that which can be clearly proven from God's word. That which can be proven from God's word, we have to agree on. So there are things that we can disagree on, but they are not doctrine. We can also make a distinction between fundamental and non-fundamental doctrines. I think that's a right distinction, a correct distinction, but it does not legitimize fellowship with pastors who teach differently in non-fundamental doctrines. Where it might have some importance is when we are dealing with especially lay people and in private settings, when we consider them to be weak in understanding, then I think we can in privately have some spiritual fellowship with lay people who do not belong to a church that teaches correctly in also in non-fundamental articles. But it should not be used to enter into fellowship with churches or practice public fellowship around the means of grace or worship with the heterodox churches. So I don't think we can make a norm outside an extra biblical norm, by which we want to decide when something becomes schismatic. The norm also of church fellowship is Scripture, and that which is clearly taught in Holy Scripture, not something else that we say this is the minimum that I would my reason try to figure out. It's Scripture, the clear Scripture passages alone that decides it.
And Pastor Terry, would you like to give your answer?
By and large, I agree with Pastor Magnus. I would like to add that in Article 7 of the Augsburg Confession, when it talks about unity being concerning the gospel and the administration of the sacraments, I think we have a tendency to want to look at that unity as being the narrow version of the gospel, the Christ's death, burial, and resurrection, rather than the summation of the teachings of Christ. And also, the administrations of the sacraments should be the appropriate or right administrations of the sacraments, not, we can both agree that it's not right or appropriate to administer the sacrament of the altar between two people of different confessions. So, when is it good to separate unity? I think when you see any degree, I mean, on a practical level, let's take, for example, the Missouri Synod. I frequently get accused of, like, taking pot shots at them, but they're easy targets. So, but when you have something that is synodically recognized to be an error and not dealt with, I think that that's a good time to leave, because then you are communing with somebody whom you actually recognize, right? According to Romans 16, you've already marked as being somebody who's persistently in error, but you're choosing not to avoid them. And in the same vein, for example, within the context of a regular congregation, let's say you have a congregation of 20 people, is it possible that one person is in error in their belief? Well, yeah. Does that mean the whole congregation is in error? No. But how the pastor responds and how that person responds should be indicative of whether or not you should stay. If the pastor is aware of that error and he doesn't address it, well, then he's tacitly supporting it. And in the same vein, the ministerium of the Missouri Synod is well aware of their heresies, and they do nothing about it. So we could rightly then consider leaving the Missouri Synod without being schismatic. Now, being schismatic would be, like Pastor Magnus said, failing to differentiate between genuine doctrine and matters of sort of a rite or ceremony, matters of practice, whether you use blue in Advent or purple. So, I think by and large me and Pastor Magnus agree.
So, the second question is, in Luther's Genesis commentary, he states that the devil took possession of the serpent, spoke through it, and so deceived it. The serpent was especially subtle, so that it yielded itself more readily to Satan's deception than did the other animals. Thoughts and comments on this view. Did Satan possess a literal snake? Did the serpent willingly surrender to this possession? Pastor Terry, would you like to go first this time?
Do I genuinely believe it was a serpent or a snake? A snake as we know it today, as in one that slithers on the ground, no. And the only reason the serpent, on your belly you shall go. What's implicit in that is that it wasn't prior to its sin on its belly. So I don't have any backing for this outside of that little intimation, but I do think that it was kind of like a dragon, or at least some, a lizard with feet.
Cool. And your comments on Luther's comment?
It yielded itself more readily to Satan's deception than did other animals. I don't know if I can agree, because that presumes a certain degree of will on behalf of the animal, right? And the animal has some degree of spiritual discernment, or at least an inclination towards, yielding toward God. I don't know if animals possess that capacity. So I'm not sure if I can agree with Dr. Luther.
Oh no, you disagree with Martin Luther. We'll have to take away your Lutheran card.
I think go ahead. Yeah, no. I mean, I don't know. In the same vein, like, do dogs, do they have these intimations where, Martin Luther said many positive things about dogs. Do animals, I think there's a broader question, which is, do animals have some innate knowledge of God or of Satan? Are they aware of evil or not? And if so, are they culpable for it? Because the implicit assumption here is that a serpent or a snake is more capable of willing itself to the devil, or that it even has the capacity to will itself towards some spiritual good or evil. I don't know if any animal can do that. I just sort of think of them as automatons. And I could definitely be wrong.
Pastor Magnus, would you like to give your answer to this question?
I'm not sure that I agree with Terry on the issue of animals in general, but I'm not sure that Luther is correct either. I think from the outset I agree with Luther. It's a possible explanation. But when I was in Australia and talking with you about it, Jake, you mentioned the interpretation, and I can't remember where you got it from, that the devil was a cherub like those in Ezekiel 10, that one represented man and another animals that was flying, and one animals on the ground.
That was Reverend Jonathan Fisk.
Okay, yeah.
That's where I got that from.
And I think
of the Missouri Synod.
And the idea was that the devil actually is a snake, or of either a man or a lion or so on. And I think there's something to that, because it is sometimes in Revelation it's called the old snake, and the Pharisees and the Sadducees are called sons of vipers, and it of course refers to Genesis 3:15 with the sons of the snake and so on. And I think it is an alternative explanation that I'm not really sure where I'll land yet, but I think there's something that seems to me that's the right interpretation. That I mean, it is a snake. The issue is it an earthly snake that is possessed by the devil, or is the devil the cherubim of the snakes, a snake-formed cherubim or a snake-formed angel? That's the two interpretations that I think are possible. I don't think we can in any way see it as a figurative, saying that it's not really a snake. It is a snake. So either the devil is a snake, or it's a snake possessed by the devil.
I mean, I can definitely agree with Magnus that it's a cherub. I believe it's in Ezekiel where God pronounces to Satan, he calls him the anointed cherub that covereth, in his condemnation of Satan. So is it possible that the devil was some form of angelic snake? Yeah, that makes more sense to me than him being what we'd consider like a regular earthly snake.
Yeah,
that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, cool. So moving on to the next question, and this is always a fun one. Why are Lutherans anti-Semitic? Or to rephrase the question, are Lutherans anti-Semitic? And I'll get Pastor Terry to start with this one as well.
Why me first?
Just for fun.
Just for fun? No. One, the presumption that anti-Semitism is a thing in Lutheranism. We don't hate people who are descendants of Jews. We don't hate people who are ethnically Jewish. I don't care what ethnicity you are or aren't. Your religion is what matters to me. And unfortunately, in the same way in which you might be opposed to Islam and then be conflated as being racist against Arabs, even though, being an Arab is a race and Islam is a religion, so it is that I am very prejudiced against Judaism as a religion and its practitioners, because it is a false religion. And I think every Christian, if they're being intellectually consistent, should despise all forms of false religion. And in the same vein, that doesn't mean that I have to hate individuals who happen to share an ethnicity with the same name as that false religion.
Cool, thank you. And Magnus, your comments?
I think I agree with Terry pretty much on this, that we are not anti-Semitic. We're anti-Judaists. I don't have a problem with Jews because of race. I do have a problem with the Jewish religion. Then there is a political issue too, and I think that Christians can have different opinions on that. I think there is a tendency for Christians to always support Israel, and there might be a tendency sometimes to overreact against that. But I think we should keep that issue about Israel as a political issue solely, and not something to give theological reasons to side with Israel or not.
Right. It's not a necessary tenet of Christianity. A lot of, I can't speak for where Pastor Magnus is or where you are in Australia, but at least in America, it's a pretty big issue amongst conservative Christianity to be Zionist and to support the nation-state of Israel. Now, a lot of this comes from their sort of faulty view of eschatology and the permeation of dispensation as sort of being the main view of the end of the world, how Jews will be redeemed by dint of being Jews. And so in America, to be anti-Zionist, or at least to kind of come along and say maybe the Palestinians have a point, you're immediately conflated with being anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
Like, or to say that, you know, eschatology almost has nothing to do with Jews, or the future coming, the beatific vision has almost nothing to do with the Jews at all, but rather it's about the church. Even then, for that, I've been called anti-Semitic, or I've been called anti-Semitic for saying the church is Israel, the church is God's chosen people, not the Jews. Well, I conflated. Well, one time I conflated Judaism for I guess theological Satanism, and it is right. Any false religion, and I wish Christians could just admit this. Any false religion, any worship outside of the true God, is ultimately a worship of self and ultimately a worship of the devil. Right? St. Paul echoes this. He says the gods of the heathens are demons. I'm failing to see the issue in me comparing Satanism to Judaism.
Well, I mean, I was just working on my sermon for Reformation, and the text I've got is from John 8, where Jesus refers to the Jews who aren't believing in him as the Messiah. He refers to them as sons of Satan.
Or, you know, and then of course you have in Revelation not just those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. There's also a reference to the Lamb, right? Who rises out of the earth, or that he's a dragon who rises out of the earth, but he has the voice of a lamb, or no, the appearance of a lamb, but the voice of the dragon. And I'm not the first person. I'm certainly not the first person, but a lot of people have interpreted this to be Pharisaic Judaism, because he forces all to worship the beast, which is the Roman Empire. And if you recall, what were the words of the Pharisees and the Judaic crowd prior to the crucifixion of our Lord? We have no king but Caesar. And so, yeah, if that's not compelling worship of the beast, what is? So, I mean, but do I hate Jews as an ethnicity? No. I don't care what your ethnicity is.
Alright, so before we get on to the next question, I just want to do a plug then related to this topic. So, if you head over to the Order of Knight George YouTube channel, I've done a video in my Little Luther series, which I've titled Little Luther on Rabbinic Judaism, which addresses this very topic. Originally I had posted it up as Little Luther on anti-Semitism, but then YouTube took it down, so I had to rename it and make a few tweaks to get it back up there without him taking it down.
Okay.
And it's such a contentious topic. It's, you know, there's that great meme where there's a group and it's Lutherans, and then someone comes in and tosses a grenade, and the grenade is labeled "on the Jews and their lies." Yeah, it's a fun topic, but it's not that big of a deal.
Now, our next question, and I'll get Magnus then to start on this one. Thoughts on apostolic succession?
Yeah. Now, the apostolic succession of the laying on of hands of bishops, I don't believe in that. I do believe that because oftentimes when the bishop was consecrated in the first 2 or 3 centuries, it was usually when the bishop before that was dead. So we can't really prove a line of succession of laying on of hands of bishops. We probably do have a presbyterial succession, but I still don't think that it's the laying on of hands in itself that is kind of what is that succession, because but there isn't. I mean, the pastors have been approved by other pastors, and I think the ministerium has existed from the time of the apostles to today, where pastors have approved other pastors, and ordination is a visible sign of that. So there is some kind of succession back to the apostles also of the ministry, but the main succession, of course, is the succession of doctrine. So I don't think that getting like episcopal succession is a thing that we need. But I mean, if we had it, fine. But I don't think we need it. And in Denmark and Norway, unlike Sweden, we after the Reformation, the bishops, they were fired. So they got new superintendents, and eventually they started calling them bishops too. But so in Denmark you've not had apostolic succession, or in Norway also not, as they have in Sweden.
Okay, Terry, your thoughts on apostolic succession?
I think it's neat in its idea. It's entirely unprovable. Pastor Magnus seems to be siding with Herman Sass on this, that it's the succession of doctrine, right? It's a continuation of the apostles' teaching, which grants genuine succession. And while I do think that it's sort of a novel idea, I see it as irrelevant. Why does it matter? You know, as if the legitimacy of a ministry is contingent on a person's ordination. Well, ordination is vital in, I guess, adding legitimacy to ministry. Who lays their hands on you? The only thing that's necessary is they too have had their hands laid on them. And I keep thinking about during the immediate post-Reformation era in Saxony, I know that they had the Lutheran pastors and priests had a pretty difficult time getting to Magdeburg at the time. And so they didn't have any pastors there. They essentially told them, hey, pick a guy who can read. He's your pastor now. And he didn't have an ordination appropriately. I mean, once they were able to arrive there, I'm sure that they installed him to some degree, or there was some degree of rite or ceremony. But the call is what generates the legitimacy of a ministry. Ordination is merely an external confirmation of that call. And so when an individual places the legitimacy of their ministry on an untenable line of succession, it tells me that you're insecure in your ability to be a minister, which sounds terrible. But I do think it's a novel idea. I wish I could prove it. Like, I wish I could prove that my ordination stretched all the way back to Clement of Rome, or whoever they claim. Or, you know, the Archbishop of Canterbury. But it doesn't matter. What matters is that I've had a call of a church, and I've had my hands laid on me by the presiding ministerium of a body, confirming that call, and so I'm able to administer the sacraments and preach the gospel. I would really like for it to be true. I would really just like to say that I possess apostolic succession, if nothing else, to kind of stick it to the papists.
If I'm just allowed to throw my 2 cents in, I remember, I don't know who I was talking to or where I read this, but someone pointed out to me once that kind of the origins of the whole apostolic succession really pops up around in the 2nd or 3rd century, where the whole idea of it was when there was all these Gnostics running around, someone could be like, hey, I was ordained by, Irenaeus, and he was ordained by such, and he was ordained by John, and so that's how you can tell that, I've been taught from these guys that were taught by the apostles, whereas those Gnostics over there have just popped up out of nowhere and have no connection to the apostles at all.
Well, yeah, and of course that works in the first couple of centuries, but eventually that argument doesn't work anymore. So today it doesn't work, because we all know that, I mean, the Jews they fell from the true doctrine, and so if they can do it, the church can too. But of course it works as an argument in the first couple of centuries or generations.
Well, I could see it as a good mechanism as a safeguard against heresy at the time, but you'd have to be able to furnish proof, one, that you were ordained by Cyprian, anyone can say that, But part of my issue, too, is you don't really see the ascendancy of the episcopal office above and against the presbyterial office until about the 4th century under Cyprian or 3rd century. And so prior to that, the genuine need for an episcopal ordination seems to have been moot. It seems to have not existed. And so we have to admit then that it is not a necessary part of the church life. And we don't see anybody claiming ordination by St. Peter or by St. Paul or by St. John prior to the 3rd century. We don't see anybody claiming credentialism, right? Well, I was ordained by St. John. Who cares? The Pharisees focused on who their rabbinic teachers were. We don't need to bother with that. We can say, and we're blessed to live in an era where we have biblical proliferation, and we can say that our churches possess the true doctrine, and thus we know that we're in league with the apostles.
So, moving on to our next question. Can you comment on the Book of Concord's approval of prayers for the dead? And I'll get Terry then to start with this question.
The way that I see that it's say I should die, and my wife, in her emotional distress, prays earnestly for the repose of my soul. Is she acting piously? Well, yes. She's acting out of comfort, appealing to God to give her comfort in her time of distress. 20 years down the line, if she's still praying in the hopes that I might ascend to heaven from purgatory, well, then no, she's not praying in faith. So if somebody is in the midst of distress and, terrified of the loss of a loved one, or, terrified for the sake of their own, anyway, yeah. If they're just afraid, then I would absolutely permit it, but I wouldn't encourage it, and I wouldn't say that it necessitates anything, right? We cannot change God's will, especially after a person has died, right? They're subject to the judgment, and where they are is where they are. Now, if they derive a sense of comfort, I'm never going to discourage anyone from praying ever for anything, even if it's the wrong thing to pray for. Maybe don't pray for God to kill somebody you don't like. But, if it's just used as a sense of comfort, and I think that's the way the Book of Concord presents it, then I think it's perfectly fine.
Magnus, your comments and thoughts.
Now, I'm not sure if we can call it an approval of prayers for the dead. What the Book of Concord says is that we do not prohibit it, and I think that's and it defends itself against the accusation that they condemn Arius, who said that you couldn't pray for the dead. Now, I think that Luther, he says, as for the dead, since Scripture gives us no information on the subject, I regard it as no sin to pray with free devotion in this or some similar fashion. Dear God, if this soul is in a condition accessible to mercy, be thou gracious to it. And when this has been done once or twice, let it suffice. So I mean, Luther says that it's not something that it's not a sin to pray in this way. But I do think it's wrong to if our prayer is based on the doctrine that you can convert after you're dead. But if a prayer is made in such a way that we do not imply that, I think it's okay to pray for the dead.
And I do think that the sort of ideology of praying for the dead does come from the system of purgatory. Right, this idea that you can pray in the hopes of remitting time off of purgatory for the sake of the deceased soul. But yeah, to prohibit prayers for the dead is something that is absent in the Book of Concord. It like Pastor Magnus said, it doesn't prohibit it. It permits it, but it gives us certain restrictions.
I also think that if we don't have to look at prayer as something that by which we ask for something that we would not otherwise get. That right. I mean, that's not how Luther explains it in the Small Catechism. Right. So we can pray for the dead in the sense that we pray for what we hope and trust that God will do, because He has promised it in His Word, that He will take these souls to Himself. So in that sense we can pray, but not in such a sense that we trust that our prayer can change the condition of a person's. Rather, we pray for that which God has promised to do, namely to take his children to himself in heaven.
Right, and I do think that that's backed up in the Small Catechism in the Lord's Prayer when we pray, thy kingdom come. Obviously, God's kingdom coming isn't contingent upon any of our prayers. We pray
Exactly.
so we pray that we may be ready to embrace that kingdom when it does come, and we may live in such a way as to conform to that kingdom.
Cool. Well, I was just going to add there, on an Issues Etc. episode, they address this section in the Book of Concord, and only very briefly, and Pastor Paul McCain there, he quoted something from Marquette, which is very similar to what Terry's first answer he gave was. I'll see if I can find that soundbite. If I can, I might stick it into the episode here, around about here. But that depends on if I can find that soundbite or not. But otherwise, go look for it yourself.
There is a part here where they're dealing with masses for the dead that might cause a bit of confusion and maybe even raise some red flags for Lutherans reading it today. And this is in paragraph 94. They say, regarding the adversary's quoting of the fathers about the offering for the dead, we know that the ancients speak of prayer for the dead, which we do not ban. And then they go on to say what we disapprove is applying the Lord's Supper to the dead through ex opere operato. How are we to understand this? We do not ban prayer for the dead.
Well, I think, first of all, again, we have to understand the nature of the apology, as the same with the Augsburg Confession, of trying to be as conciliatory as possible. So when it refers to prayers for the dead, which we do not ban, this in no way would justify the kind of prayers for the dead and the kind of praying for the dead that went on at the time in the Roman Catholic Church. And, of course, the chief prayer for the dead was offering masses for them. Now, again, I'm going to have to cite Kurt Marquardt. He had a very nice way of dealing with this. He said, if you wish once or twice after a loved one is dead to basically say something in effect, thank you, O Lord, for receiving them into your gracious favor in eternal life, something like that, that's fine. But then let it go. You don't keep this up. You don't make this a big part of the liturgy. And notice they say praying for the dead, not as if you're praying, oh, dear Lord, please save them, even though they were a bunch of filthy pagans. We don't do that. And notice it doesn't say praying to the dead, which was the chief error. Our biggest beef would be praying to the dead saints. So it's an aside, and I have some good friends that will disagree with me. It's an aside. It's not a dogmatic assertion. It's not prescriptive of what we must do today, but I don't know, maybe that's enough said.
Cool. So moving on to the next question, and I might get Pastor Magnus to start with this one just because I've had chats with him about it. Was the Last Supper a Passover Seder? Why or why not? Pastor Magnus, your turn.
Yeah, I don't think it was. I mean, it's not a doctrinal matter, but I don't think it was, and for two reasons. The first reason is that the best way to reconcile John with the synoptics is to let the simple understanding of John be correct and understand the other as in another way. The Passover was on the 14th day and the first day of, and it was understood by some as being the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Which was then a continuation of the same. Started at sunset. No work was to be done on the first of the 7 days. That means from the 15th. If it was a Passover, then they would be burying Jesus on the feast of the 7 days of the unleavened bread, which was against the rules. The what is called the Passover meal in the Synoptics is probably a pre-Passover meal after sunset at the beginning of the day of Passover, which began at sunset. And I think the text actually supports this because no lamb is mentioned, and the bread is not even called asumos, unleavened bread, but atos, which just means bread. And this meal was sometimes called Passover because it was at the beginning of the Passover, which started at sunset. But the Passover lamb was eaten after sunset the next day. So I think rather that Jesus died around the time when the Passover lamb was sacrificed in the temple. And I think this explanation seems to be the only one that can actually reconcile all the Gospels. Now, the second reason why I don't think it was a Passover Seder is that there is a near consensus that the Seder, as known afterwards, didn't exist before the destruction of the temple. So what we know as the Seder today is something, probably a lot of it made by Rabbinic Judaism, which tried to reinvent Judaism after the destruction of the temple, and it might even be influenced by Christian Easter celebrations. And there's a reason why they had to develop a lot of ceremonies afterwards, because the main thing, when we look at sources from the time of the temple, the main thing around Passover was sacrifice in the temple and what happened in the temple. Now, when the temple was gone and the sacrifice was gone, they had to kind of reinvent what Judaism was, and it was the Pharisees who did it. And this lay celebration in the home became more important, and they had to develop more and more rituals here. So what we know as the Seder today probably doesn't have a lot to do with how the lamb was eaten at the time of Jesus anyway. So for these two reasons, I don't think it was a Passover Seder, and I don't think Christians should eat Christian Seders in any way.
And Pastor Terry, your thoughts on this?
I didn't know the first part of Pastor Magnus's answer was really informative. I never really knew that. The second part is where I agree. I don't think it was a Passover Seder, because a Seder, as we know it today, with its various pronunciations and times of drinking particular amounts of wine and times of eating particular amounts of food, wasn't invented at least until 80 AD, if not later. So I don't think Jesus can celebrate, or would have celebrated, I guess a ceremony that didn't exist at his time. But outside of that, I have no reason to say no. And the way that the gospel texts read is that there was bread and wine. Christ himself was a sacrificial lamb, and that was the summation of it. There didn't seem to be a whole lot of ceremony. There didn't seem to be a whole lot of steps. It was, this is my body, this is my blood. They ate, they drank, and then the continuation of the Passion story happened from there. So which granted, that's an argument from silence, but still, I don't see it as being a Passover Seder meal, and then on top of that, the Passover Seder meal just didn't exist at the time.
Before we get going on to the next question, I've just got a thought on this, and I wanted to get your opinions on this. One of the reasons why I question whether it was like a Passover Seder or like the Passover meal is that the Pharisees and the high priest and all them were out, Jesus and the disciples were out in the Garden of Gethsemane, and then all the Pharisees and the high priest and all these came out and arrested him out in the garden. And unless I'm mistaken, wasn't a whole part of the celebration of the Passover that you had to remain inside during the night? So if it was a Passover, then they should have been inside and not outside.
Yeah. And also, all the synoptics actually agree that Christ was crucified at the day of preparation, and also one of the reasons why they wanted to take him at that time was that they would not put him to death on the feast, on the first day of the unleavened bread, because at that day the courts would be closed. They wouldn't be allowed to do anything, so they would break a lot of laws if it was a Passover Seder, and that was their point, that Jesus was breaking the law.
Alrighty, moving on to the next question. It's just Semper Virgo, question mark. Pastor Terry, we'll get you to start with this.
Well, isn't it sort of a pity that Phil Moore can join us for this? Semper Virgo, I'm for it. I see it as necessary to fulfill some of the Ezekiel temple typology. I see it as being natural consequences of certain lines in the New Testament, like the giving of care of Mary to John. Right? If Jesus had half brothers, they're actually failing in their duty to take care of Mary upon his death, unless they, for some reason, were all dead at the time. It's presumed that St. Joseph was dead at the time. So yeah, I'm. That's sort of where I'm at. Obviously it's a bit obscure. I don't, some people point to Jesus having brothers, or behold your families here. That could easily be translated as kin or just simply family. And I do I do find myself falling in line with the tradition that Joseph was probably an older man who had children, who himself was a widower, and had married Mary as sort of a protective or a custodial marriage, where, he provided sustenance for her and she tended to his house.
And Magnus?
Yeah, I think I agree with Terry on Semper Virgo. I don't believe it is doctrine, so I'll say that, well, I believe that she remained virgin. I don't require anyone in my fellowship to think that. So, yeah. But I think at this now, I'm convinced that she remained.
That's a question to ask Fillmore. Does he force his congregants to subscribe to Semper Virgo to commune?
Next question is the Hong Kong protests a just war? And with that as well, is it in keeping with the fourth commandment? So, Magnus, we'll get you to start with this then.
Yeah, I haven't followed them enough to know exactly the details. But from what I know, I'm not sure that they are a just war. I'm not sure we can call something a just war if it is not started by at least a lesser magistrate. I mean, I think a lesser magistrate can defend its subjects against a higher magistrate, and can go into just war against a higher magistrate. But that's not, as far as I can see, what's happening here, and I'm not convinced that I mean, one could argue that house fathers, they count as lesser magistrates. I'm not convinced that they do, and not in this situation, not from what I'm reading. I mean, there could be, I cannot rule out that there could be situations where you will have to, where a house father would have to defend his house against a magistrate, but I don't think that's what's happening here as far as I can see.
Terry, your answer.
I'm certainly sympathetic to them. I understand. Well, I don't understand, but I can only imagine what it's like to live under the Chinese regime. But no, it's not a just war in the same way that the American Revolution was not a just war. Just because you dictate that the people above you are acting or behaving unjustly doesn't mean that you have the right to fight against them, right? Romans 13 tells us that the government bears the sword, that they are a servant for the sake of God, and that they are divinely appointed, even if they act evilly. And of course, St. Paul is writing this while he's under Neronian persecution. We can't say that Nero was exactly, the beautiful philosopher king written of Plato, who was gentle and loving. And in the same way, the Chinese regime is awful. They are abusive, they are militant, they're dictatorial, but that doesn't necessarily give its citizens the right to revolt against it. So for it to be defined justly, it would have to be advocated by God, and I don't see that as being the case within the Hong Kong protests. I do think that there's a way that they can attempt to engage their government civilly, and I mean, to what degree of success they would have in the Chinese regime is debatable. But yeah, no, I definitely don't see it as just either.
So the next question then is, and this is something that's come from the Australian situation, the Victorian state government wants to force priests to break the seal of the confessional if pedophiles or rapists or murderers confess their sins. Should priests break the confessional in these situations? And there's a follow-on question with that is, if no, should priests obey the government and break the seal of the confessional, or should they defy the government and keep the seal? So, Tara, we'll get you to start with this one.
I think this one's pretty simple. The answer is they should defy the government and keep the seal of confession. We're not given a choice upon ordination, and we're called to retain the sins of whom we retain. We're called to lose the sins of those whom we lose. We're not called to divulge those sins to any government official. And in this case, I think we have to mimic the apostles in Acts 2 in saying that we must obey God rather than man, even if we're to endure persecution for it. Now, it's kind of sad that, it's a sad thought to think that a priest would not in some way act should someone confess to them having molested a child. But I also think that part of confession, and Magnus can correct me here, is the priest encouraging the penitent to take appropriate corrective action. So if I had an individual who came to me in confession and he said, for example, that he had murdered someone, well, along with the absolution pronounced, I would encourage him to turn himself into the appropriate authorities as part of an act of penance. Now, obviously, the forgiveness isn't contingent upon him doing that. The forgiveness is contingent upon him being repentant, but it would be bearing fruit in keeping with that repentance to follow God's law and submit to governing authorities.
And Magnus, your answer to this question?
Yeah, I pretty much agree with Terry that we should defy the government if it is really a confession of sin. I mean, if they have the intent of continuing in this sin, I do think we have a duty to prevent further child molesting. But if it is a confession of the sin and a genuine confession where they are repentant, then it is we cannot break the confessional seal.
Pastor Magnus, I'm curious, how would you define a genuine confession versus a non-genuine one if they're approaching you within the context of confessional seal?
I'm not trying to judge their hearts, but if what they are saying is that they'll continue doing this.
Okay, so if they openly admit.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Alrighty, moving on to the next question. Is Michael the Archangel Jesus? Magnus?
Yeah, until I prepared last night, I was convinced that he is. Because I've been convinced of that for some time. But, I did study it a bit more last night, and I checked up on some articles on it, and I'm not convinced anymore, so I'm not really sure now. I mean, the evidence in favor of Michael being the Son of God, which has been used by the Reformers, is Revelation 12, where he's fighting against the dragon and his angels and defeats it, and this is seen by the Reformers as something he does through the church, and therefore it must be Christ. Now, against seeing this, I mean, of course, also the name Michael, who's like God, is an argument in favor of him being the angel of the Lord, who is Christ in the Old Testament. No doubt about that. But against it is Daniel 10, 5-6, where Michael is separated from the man mentioned here, because the man mentions Michael to Daniel, and this man is the same as in I think in Daniel 7, and he's identified in Revelation 1:13-16 as Christ. So the man speaking to Daniel in Daniel 10 is clearly Christ, and but he's speaking about Michael as someone separate from him. So now Callow, I was reading Christian Preuss, he made an article about it, and he pointed out that Callow tried to get around this, but I'm not convinced. He said that because it says that hand was laid on him, and earlier Gabriel does that, he says that there's a kind of change of persons who speak to Daniel in Daniel 10, but I'm not convinced about that. So actually I'm not convinced that the Reformers were right about identifying Michael as Christ. I'm fully convinced that the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament is Christ, but I'm not convinced that it's the same one as Michael anymore.
Terry?
No, so part of the reason I don't think that Michael is Christ is because of the same reason that some people do, which is his name, who is like God. yeah, it could be seen as being something of a declarative of the person, but it can also be seen as a statement, right? Who is like God? Asked in rhetoric. Also, the man mentioned in Daniel 9, interestingly enough, or Daniel 10, I also don't see as being a Christophany or the angel of the Lord, in part because he requires Michael's aid, right? He said that he was coming to Daniel upon the advent of his fasting, but was withheld by the king of Babylon until he was helped by Michael, your prince. So I'm not convinced that Michael or this man, because if it was truly Christ, nothing could withhold him.
Well, that could be an argument for him actually being Michael. If the man in Daniel 10, I mean, that's the argument that convinced me that he might not be, but if that guy is not Christ, then Michael might be Christ anyway. So I'll have to look further into that again.
I think part of my issue with Michael being Christ is I do like entertaining the idea that Christ himself doesn't fight the devil. He just sends an underling. You know, an angel. Someone equivalent to, we already discussed, you know, Satan being a cherub. Well, he just sends another angel. He sends another.
Yeah.
And of course, with the declarative statement, who is like God, Christ doesn't need to fight the devil. He's already won anyway. And he's the one that cast Satan from heaven to begin with. So, I mean, I honestly didn't know that people genuinely, like, outside of a few, like, the Jehovah's Witnesses, I legitimately didn't know that people actually held this position. Which, maybe I'm just ignorant, but I've never really even considered Michael to be Christ.
But both Lutheran, Melanchthon, and Callow did, so...
Cool. If I can jump in then, hold it to take a dissenting view to you guys then, because like as you were saying there, Terry, like I myself had just thought, oh yeah, Michael is an archangel, he's not Jesus, and I'd heard different Lutheran pastors, again like Reverend Fisk on his podcast, taking more of the position that Michael is Jesus, and I've heard other pastors take that. And I wrote a sermon on Revelation 12 for St. Michael's and All Angels Day. And I started off being more convinced of that Michael wasn't Jesus. And after I did more research, I don't know, I ended up probably going more the other direction of saying that I think Michael might actually be Jesus. Or at least he's a Christ figure in that way. In like my sermon, I put in some of the arguments that I'd got from my research. I found actually quite a lot of Lutheran theologians do hold to the position that Michael is Jesus, and that actually there was a lot of church fathers that held to that position as well. So it's one of those positions, it's one of those debates again where people can go, there's a lot of people that can go one way or the other on this issue.
I mean, I suppose it's an acceptable position to hold as long as you don't view Jesus or Michael as being a lesser being than God, right? That's the Arian heresy, and Jehovah's Witnesses today believe that Jesus is Michael, a lesser created angel, right?
But it's actually a good argument against the Jehovah's Witnesses, because now if you accept that Michael is Jesus, then all their arguments fall, because their argument is from 1 Thessalonians 4:16, that when it says that for the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a cry of command, with the voice of an archangel, and with the sound of the trumpet of God, where they say, well, there you see, he's an archangel. But I mean, if one accepts that Michael is Christ, then the term archangel is actually a title for the uncreated angel of the Lord. So it doesn't mean a created angel. It means the exact opposite.
As I put in my sermon.
Okay.
Well, the problem with that then, as you face, is that there are other beings identified as archangels.
Actually, there's
in
not.
the Bible?
Not in the New
Testament. Not in the Bible, no, but in church history, yes.
I did, because I looked this up. I looked this up in the New Testament. The only time archangel is ever used in is that Thessalonians text where it talks about Jesus with the voice of an archangel, and then in the book of Jude where it talks about Michael being an archangel.
Oh, contending for the body of Moses.
Yeah.
So I went from I flipped from you, Terry. I actually went from, well, I don't know, you probably flipped from what Magnus did. I went from being like, nah, Michael's definitely an angel and couldn't be Jesus, to actually researching and going, well, maybe he could be actually Jesus.
I'll have to look into it myself. I didn't know that anybody actually held this position. I thought this was honestly like a softball question. I'm like, of course not. That's what Jehovah's Witnesses believe.
Oh, I might hear Jake's sermon and then flip back.
I think one of the main differences is that, like, with the Jehovah's, they're like saying that Jesus is Michael, a created being, whereas more in the Christian point of view, what we're actually saying is that
Michael's just another name for Jesus.
Yeah, and that actually, like, when you talk about, like, Jesus as the angel of the Lord, and you talk about Michael the angel, you're using angel in the same sense. Or, like, in Revelation, because a lot of that is vision and symbolism, that, you know, Michael the archangel is more just like a symbol of Jesus fighting, you know, Jesus defeating the devil, rather than there being, like, a literal Michael stabbing.
Well, yeah, going back to the Daniel text you mentioned, Michael is in that text called your prince, I suppose referring to the prince of the people of Israel, because that's for whom Daniel was praying, which would make a lot of sense and would be pretty consistent with Michael being Christ, because Christ is the prince of Israel.
One of the other arguments I put in is that Michael in Revelation is referred to the commander of the Lord's armies. And if you go back to the book of Joshua, where the commander of the Lord's army appears before Joshua, Joshua actually worships him, showing that he's not an ordinary angel. He'd have to be the angel of the Lord, because he's actually worshipped. And regular angels always make the point of saying, don't worship me, whereas whenever the angel of the Lord gets worshipped, he's kind of cool with it.
Yeah, that has been my argument too. When I was convinced that he was that this is clearly Christ in Joshua 5. So this similarity that they are both commanders of the Lord's army was what first convinced me.
I'll definitely have to read up more on that.
Now, another point with the Jehovah's Witnesses is that their argument is really based on paperless tradition, which would be a funny thing to point out to them, because it's the paperless tradition of what an archangel is. They wouldn't like to point that out.
Well, just as an aside, even the name they have for God, right? Jehovah, the one that they insist on, is a combination of the four letters of God's name, Yod He Vav He, and then the vowel sounds from the word Lord, Adonai, right? And you end up with Jehovah.
Yeah.
I love pointing out to them that this sort of amalgamation happened in the 9th century by a Catholic monk. Because they hate papism so much, but they borrow so much from their tradition. It's funny.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, let's move on to our next question, which is, does the Bible command us to love ourselves? And open question, who wants to go first?
Magnus, you want to go first?
Yeah, I can go first. Yeah. If you want me to.
Don't all jump in at once.
No, I don't think it commands us to love ourselves. It's not an imperative when it says love your neighbor as yourself. It doesn't say that you should love your neighbor like you should love yourself. It says love your neighbor as you actually love yourself. Now, what people today see as lack of self-love or self-esteem, I think it is often disappointed self-love and pride rather than real lack of love for oneself. Now, Ephesians 5 actually assumes that no one hates his own body, and I think that could be also applied to the soul. It says in Ephesians 5:28-30, in the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it as just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. So that actually implies that no one hates his own body, and I think that applies to the soul too. I don't think anyone actually hates it, but people who are prideful, oftentimes when they are disappointed about themselves, they will see this as people will say this is lack of self-love. I don't think it is very often. I think it's too often, at least. It's more based on self-love and pride and disappointment about yourself.
And Terry, your thoughts?
Well, yeah, that's it. It's funny because the Ephesians text was the exact text I had in mind. Self-love is sort of presumed as being the normal state of man. You don't need to tell a person to seek or want or do things for themselves. We do it by inclination. Now, so I don't think there needs to exist any imperative to tell a man to love himself. As a matter of fact, I think we love ourselves a little too much. Now, I don't think that means that we need to be self-loathing, and I don't think anybody teaches that today. I mean, I don't know of any particular Christian asceticism anymore. But I also kind of agree with Magnus that self-loathing, I really do think, still extends from self-love. Right? Self-loathing is still a focus. It's still curvatus in se. It's still looking at oneself. And that's not the obligation of the Christian. The obligation of the Christian is to look outward and unto Christ rather than look at yourself. Now, as far as doing those things which are needful for your body, absolutely. You should eat food. You should probably eat food that you enjoy. These are God's providential gifts. You should enjoy the planet. It's okay to take a vacation. God has given us this stuff so that we can enjoy it. But there's no divine imperative to constantly augment your life for the sake of yourself. As a matter of fact, there's a divine imperative to the opposite, which is to augment your life for the betterment of your neighbor as you would yourself. So yeah, I don't think there exists a single imperative towards self-love in the Bible. It's just a presumption that you already do. And sometimes simply so, and we need to curb that a little bit.
Alrighty, well, before we get on to our last question then for the episode, I'd just like to remind everybody that the Order of Knight George has our own publishing house. If you'd like to find any of the books released by published by the Order of Knight George, you can go to our website www.knightgeorge.info and click on the books tab, and you'll be able to find the complete catalogue of all the books we have. And also, as always, each panel mentions the Order of Knight George Book of the Month, and the Book of the Month for October 2019 is my latest book that I've just released, so self-plug, is Should We Have Lay Distributors? In this book I discuss the practice of using lay people to distribute the Holy Communion, and in this book I look at 4 main topics. Is this practice biblical? Is this practice confessionally Lutheran? Is this practice historical? And is this practice necessary? So I encourage people to go and check this out. Whether you agree with me or not, I actually would rather just have people go and read this book for it to be a conversation starter, because not a lot of people have actually bothered to even consider this question. And I myself hadn't even considered this question until a fellow pastor in the Lutheran Church of Australia that I used to be a part of actually pointed it out to me, because it was a matter that he was thinking about, and I hadn't even given it much thought until that point. So I would encourage plenty of people to go and read the book, if only to just have a bit of food for thought. But getting on now to our last question for the episode. As I've done for every panel this year, I asked the panelists, what is an unexpected hardship or low point of your ministry, and what is a surprising joy or high point of your ministry? Magnus, you did answer this question earlier in the year when you were on a panel, I think in March, and so things may have changed or they may be the same. Either way, people probably don't remember, so I'll get you to start with this question. What is an unexpected hardship of your ministry, and what is a surprising joy?
Well, I think the unexpected hardship is the times that I've had to leave fellowship with other pastors and congregations, which has happened a few times now. And the surprising joy has been to enter fellowship again and finding like-minded people who believe the same doctrine and believe the doctrine of the Word. So that's a surprising joy that happens again, that God unites us in the true doctrine.
And Pastor Terry.
The lowest point, I think, has been just, it's kind of been antithetical to Pastor Magnus's. Like you guys, I have a sanctuary in my house, and I'm working on, getting people to come. And I'll find people who seem to be interested in learning more, and this has happened more than I'd have to say 10 or 15 times, where, we'll get to talking about it, they'll say, oh, that's interesting, or they'll express some degree of interest in the Lutheran perception of the gospel or in the Lutheran faith, and then you try to follow up with them, and you hear nothing, or they've changed their mind, or they've just been consumed by the cares of this world, and so you're sort of left alone. And it is sort of difficult being independent, because you just don't have people to really talk to. You don't have fellow pastors with whom you're in agreement to talk to about this, so you're kind of left alone to sort of figure it out on your own, and that's really been the most difficult part. And and I know it shouldn't be, I guess, a point, but it does sort of hurt your pride to step out on Sunday and you see just your relatives there. People who are obligated to be there.
Yeah.
And the high point, though, has been, ironically, outside of the church setting in a lot of ways. Since my education and my further study, I've been able to, my other job is a nurse, and I deal a lot with people who are near death or dying, and I deal a lot with people who are in the midst of probably the worst parts of their life. And it's been a real joy to talk to some of them as a fellow Christian, to be able to say, the Lord's Prayer with them, or to be able to, talk to them about a particular verse that might bring them comfort, or just talk to them about Christ altogether, who brings comfort in the context of suffering. And one of the most enlightening things that I ever read during my course of seminary was from the Compend of Lutheran Theology by Dr. Leonard Hutter. And in there he wrote about the comfort that we feel, or should feel, in the midst of suffering, knowing that we're enjoining ourselves to Christ's suffering. And that it's been a tremendous thing to be able to tell people this, that God is not aloof from your despair. God is not uncaring. God knows how it is to feel pain. And it's a tremendous privilege to be able to bring people some degree of spiritual relief.
Well, thank you both for coming on this panel for October 2019. Disappointed that we didn't end up getting Filmer on. We'll have to try and see if we can get him on another panel, with or without you guys. We'll see what the future brings. But thanks to both of you for taking the time out of your day to do this panel. So I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope the listeners have enjoyed listening to your answers. That's the end. Goodbye and God bless.